Welcome everybody to the 44th Cultural Majlis. It gives me great pleasure to be hosting our guest tonight, someone that I had the pleasure of meeting about 3 years ago in Cambridge, in the UK, where he is based. And even ended up writing an article about his work, although as you will learn today, books could be written about what Ahmed Paul Keeler has done and it won't do him justice. This is the 44th Cultural Majlis, and it's the last one for this season before we take a short break, and we'll be back, I think, hopefully in a few weeks. But to introduce Ahmed Paul Keeler, I have Rachel Winter, who's a PhD candidate in art history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And Rachel has actually been in touch previously with Ahmed, so I'm really happy that she's doing this. Go ahead, Rachel.
Thank you, Sultan. It is a great privilege to introduce our speaker today, Ahmed Paul Keeler. Ahmed was born in 1942 in Windsor and christened Paul Godfrey. Raised throughout the 1940s and 50s in a conservative, upper-middle-class Anglo-Catholic family, Keeler belonged to the last generation educated to serve an empire that was in the final stages of its own dissolution. Upon leaving college, a place that Keeler describes in his autobiography as, quote-unquote, feeding students a diet of unremitting angst, he became very deeply involved in 1960s cultural movements that openly revolted against the very society that nurtured him. A chance encounter with the master Indian sitarist Mahmoud Mirza in the late 1960s, however, would introduce Keeler to a new cultural realm, leading Keeler to first curate the World of Islam in 1971, an exhibition and mini-festival held at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, which gave way to the World of Islam Festival in London in 1976, an event that is not only one of the largest and most comprehensive exhibitions of Islamic art and culture ever to be displayed in the West, but also an event so grand and important that Her Majesty the Queen herself opened the festival and its key exhibition, The Arts of Islam. 6 months before the festival opened, Keeler embraced Islam. I first came to know of Ahmed through the work of American art critic Amy Golden, who wrote about the World of Islam Festival as the greatest exhibition of Islamic art since the 1910 show in Munich, Masterpieces of Mohammedan Art. I was intrigued with the festival, which seemed to be this cultural landmark, but was the subject of such little scholarship. I then learned of Ahmed, whose biography and ardent study of Islam inspired the festival. I first met Ahmed, so to speak, in the archives, reading troves of letters between him and his fellow co-organizers of the World of Islam Festival, learning about his steadfast fight for the value of the incredible undertaking that was the festival, continually advocating for the festival's importance in the face of criticism, and working hard to secure the necessary funding. I went on to read his autobiography and watch his many lectures about the festival, slowly gaining a clearer picture of his ongoing study and personal relationship with Islam. More recently, I've exchanged many emails with Ahmed, who has very kindly answered my many questions as I endeavor to write a significant portion of my dissertation on the World of Islam Festival, an event that was not only important for introducing Western audiences to the breadth and complexity of Islam, but also an event that inspired an interest in the Islamic world that would later impact galleries and museums. Since the festival's conclusion in 1976, Ahmed has spent his life establishing and engaging in projects that explore and present Islamic culture as a holistic environmental manifestation. Residing in Cambridge for the last 27 years, Keeler has had a profound impact on a number of students passing through the university. At a time of growing instability, he is now lecturing and participating in seminars, encouraging us to judge the success of human culture through the criteria of Mizan, which is at the heart of the Islamic unfolding. Prior to his current position as visiting fellow at the Center of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge, Keeler was previously a distinguished fellow at the Faculty of Leadership and Management at University Sains Islam in Malaysia in 2016. He received his honorary doctorate of laws from the University of Bolton also in 2016. Keeler has also written about his life and experiences in his autobiography, Reflections of an English Muslim, and his more recent book, Rethinking Islam and the West, a new narrative for the age of crises. Without any further ado, it is my great honor to introduce Ahmed Keeler.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that introduction. Ahmed, if you allow me, I will now be sharing my screen and we will commence with the talk immediately. There you go. So this is the lovely logo of the World of Islam Festival, and we will go to the first slide. Ahmed, it's all yours. Go for it.
Well, this picture of me in 1961 when I just left school and my first encounter with the world of Islam. This is when I went with a friend who was a classicist, and we drove through Europe, through Germany, through Yugoslavia, through Bulgaria, and we arrived in Turkey. And at that time, there was no tourism. The roads were still the sort of dirt roads, which you had to develop a certain speed to be able to go over them, because it was otherwise the car would be broken to pieces. They were just beginning to build the main highway between Istanbul and Ankara. So I was very privileged to just experience a little corner of the Islamic world before the whole modern tourism and the modern hotels and everything really developed and changed everything very fundamentally. It was an incredible trip because my postcards home, which I read after about 60 years, my postcards home revealed that I was absolutely enamored by Turkey. It was a completely new experience. The friendliness and the whole atmosphere was quite different. And I remarked upon that. And I was said when I came back from the journey that the one place I wanted to return to was Turkey. I said terrible things about Islam. I said it was a pity they had this silly religion, Islam, which of course beautifully reflects my education. Because as an Englishman brought up in the twilight of empire, the Islamic world was one which was seen through the eyes of the Crusades and wasn't taken very seriously at this time. But my actual experience of that world was something that would live with me. And this was my first encounter. My second encounter was when I had an art gallery called Signals. And this gallery was specializing in kinetic art. We're now in the sort of mid-60s. And the artists, and if we see the next slide, the artists, most of them came from South America. And have you got the next slide?
This one, yes.
Yeah. And these artists were very deeply affected and enamored by the art of the Alhambra and the art of Moorish Spain. So this was my first encounter with, or this is my second encounter with Islamic art. And so I began to know a little bit about Moorish Spain. Then if we can go to the next slide, we see me at the end of the 60s, having had a phenomenal 60s. I'd been really engaged in all the revolutionary movements imaginable. And by the end of the 60s, I was pretty well exhausted. And this was the sort of end of this is the time when the young were really rejecting the whole of the hardness and the Vietnam War and all the kind of failure, if you like, of Western civilization, the darkness, the gloominess of it, and wishing to make a new start. But we were lost. We were lost children of the West. And it was at this time that I had the great meeting, the third encounter with Dar al-Islam, with the Muslim world. So unlikely, such an extraordinary moment, because of course at that time we were all very much enamored with India. But the India that we were imagining was the India which was of the Hindus. We didn't know anything about Islam in India. And then we had this meeting, and I met this musician, Ustad Ahmed Mirza. And if you go to the next slide, that is me a few months later. And it's one of the very few pictures of myself that I actually like, because I look genuinely happy. And when I record back at that moment, it was such a wonderful period, because there's nothing like entering a world that was so pure and so beautiful as this traditional art from northern India, the great art of the Mughal courts. This is a high court art, and it's a profoundly refined art. And it's an art that was imbued with the Shishti order of Sufism. And it was an art which actually has the capacity, when in the hands of a master, to actually carry you to that point of peace, which is what it's all about. So for me, this moment and this meeting and this privilege that I had of being able to literally bask in the baraka of this music completely transformed my life. I saw the world through new eyes, through new ears. And I spent 2 years immersed in the music and the culture, because Ustad Ahmed Mirza is a man of great culture, and he knows about his culture, and he knows where everything comes from. So he was able to teach me about the background of Mughal India, and how from Amir Khusro in the 13th century, in the early 14th century, you have this incredible unfolding of the arts of Muslim India. So while I was with him in these 2 years, intensely engaged in understanding this, having become more and more interested in his culture, I organized a tour of the East Coast of America of his music. And then I organized this little festival of the arts of Mughal India to place his music within its context. And if we can go to the next slide. We came back to England, and it was in the British Library, which was the reading room of the British Museum, where I had the most important thought, understanding of my life, which was that I had known something about Moorish Spain. And if we can go to the next slide. I'd known that from my gallery. I'd learned about Andalusia and the Moorish Spain and the Alhambra, Cordoba, and all the beauty of that. And now I was being introduced to Mughal India. And I realized that these two worlds were the same world. It was the same aesthetic. It was the same ethical structure. It was the same visual world that went from Cordoba right through to Delhi. And yet, the only thing that connected Moorish Spain and Mughal India was Islam. And this was an astonishing realization at that time, because the unity that was required to marry all these different languages and all these different cultures and all these different prehistories into one world was incredible. And that unity has been the fundamental basis of my whole life in terms of understanding, because having seen it in the arts, I spent the rest of my life pursuing it in all the other fields of Islam, because it has to be there. So I went to the Institute of Contemporary Arts, which I had been engaged with during my gallery days and proposed to them a festival of the world of Islam. And this festival took place in the winter, November, December 1971. And there were some wonderful exhibitions. We bought for the first time the Mevlevi Whirling Dervishes from Konya in Turkey. And it was a success, well received, but there was a big problem. And if we could go to the next slide. Here we have a Switzerland. Why are we in Switzerland? We're in Switzerland because a very important thing happened in Switzerland. My little festival at the Institute of Contemporary Arts had, 6 months before it took place, there was a financial problem. The Arts Council of Great Britain withdrew certain of its grants from the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and I suddenly found that the money for my festival had been withdrawn. So the director said to me 6 months before it was to take place, either you have to cancel it or you have to raise the money yourself. So I raised some money, but by the time the festival took place, there was a debt of £10,000 when it was over. And this was serious money in those days, in 1971. And I was in a terrible situation. Well, it so happened that my brother got married in Zurich in January of 72, and he invited us over to the wedding, and I went a week early, and I went up into the mountains, and I don't usually do this kind of thing. I'm a very sociable type, but this is one time when I did it because I had a big problem. And I went and spent a week in a chalet pondering what to do. What could I do now? This was a serious thing. And then I asked myself the question, is the World of Islam Festival a good idea? And the answer that came back from my voice was, yes, it's a good idea, but you've got to do it on the top level. You've got to engage all the major institutions. You've got to do it through all the media. It's a big idea, this. You must do it through film, through books, through seminars, lectures, performances, and of course the exhibition program has got to be the finest it's ever been. And Her Majesty the Queen has got to open it. And I said, is that it? Is that what I've got to do? I said, yes, because if you do that, then the first festival is the beginnings. It's the preparation for this new festival. You can raise the money. It's the seed money. So I came back to England and I went straight to the Arts Council of Great Britain, because this was the key institution. This was the institution that had to play the linchpin role, the anchor. And I went to the director of the exhibitions and he liked the idea very much, but he said, you've got a problem. And that is that the chairman of the exhibitions committee doesn't like Islamic art. And if he turns it down, which he's almost certainly likely to turn it down, then that's it. We can't reintroduce it. But he retires in a year. And the new chairman, he'll definitely accept it. So I had to keep the debt and the whole thing alive for a whole year. So what I did is I went to all the other institutions. I went to the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum and proposed to them that they put on major exhibitions of their collections. I went to the Science Museum and I said, if the Arts Council of Great Britain agree to do this exhibition, the main Arts of Islam exhibition, will you put it on an exhibition on the sciences? And then I went to the Museum of Mankind and put to them the idea of an exhibition of a nomad and city. And then to the British Library for the central piece of the Holy Quran, the exhibition of the Qurans, and so on and so forth, until I had about a dozen major institutions in London who said that they would participate in the festival if the Arts Council agreed to play the major role of the central piece. And then I went to the BBC, and the BBC at this time were basking in the glory of civilization, which had been an incredible success, the first great color documentary on art, civilization. And they were looking for a new series. And I proposed to them a series on the world of Islam. And they looked at it, and we had many meetings, and in the end, they turned it down. And the reason they turned it down was they said there simply just would not be enough interest. Nobody knows anything about the world of Islam. It's not of interest. Can you imagine? And so they turned it down. But all the other institutions were ready to act. The new chairman came in, the Arts Council agreed that central exhibition was in place, if we can go to that central exhibition. And we had the £200,000 was put forward by the Arts Council to support this exhibition. And then all the other institutions agreed. And we had the largest cultural project that has ever been put on in London in terms of high culture, a study of a civilization. So the next big thing was to actually put together a trust to support the project. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to just introduce this gentleman, the Raja of Mahmudabad, wonderful, wonderful man who was the director of the Islamic Cultural Center in London. And this is the foundation stone for the new mosque, the Regent Street Mosque, which is well known. And we're standing beside that. And he was my first trustee and was incredibly helpful, because if you can imagine, I was in my 20s, I didn't know anything about the Islamic world. And this man was a great guide and help, because he knew all the ambassadors, he knew all the people, and he knew the Islamic world with great depth. So we can go to the next slide. And then the next person who was very important was Alistair Duncan, who again was somebody, he was a wonderful photographer and writer. And I met him at the launch of his book, The Noble Sanctuary, when he was at the book launch. And he knew the people in the diplomatic side. He knew the people engaged and interested in the Islamic world and particularly the Arab world at that time, which meant that I was in a position to be able to access and to engage with him to put together the trust. And then if we can go to the next slide, and there we have a situation where we had all the institutions engaged, committed. In October 1973, the World of Islam Trust was formed. That same month, the oil price quadrupled. Suddenly, there was a huge amount of money available from the Gulf states and from Iran. Quite extraordinary. If you just look at that graph, it just went up. It was October 1973, but also terribly sad and a huge blow to me, the Raja of Mahmudabad died. And a support that was of such great importance to me was no longer with me. So we can go on to our next slide. Alistair Duncan and myself went and we had a meeting at the UAE embassy with His Excellency Ahmed El-Suwaidi and His Excellency Mahdi El-Tajir, the ambassador. And I had put together this album, which looks pretty primitive today, but believe me, at the time it was quite sophisticated. And I went through and presented the project to them. And a week later, I was in the Lusac bookshop just opposite the British Library, the British Museum, and the owner came to me and said, "I have the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates on the telephone, and he wants to speak to you." And he said, "Mr. Keeler, we like your project very much. We're going to contribute £500,000, and we're going to guarantee a further £500,000." And the project was secure. We had to raise a further 2 or 3 million. I think it was about 2 million. But anyway, we had to raise a lot more money. But in fact, the UAE continued to be the major supporter of the project. Next slide. The festival brought together a huge galaxy of academics, scholars, curators, librarians in an incredible work. Three are very important people in the project. Professor Yusuf Ibish, Said Hussein Nasr, and Titus Burkhardt were very much involved in the central exhibition program. Next slide. And then there were a galaxy. I worked it out one day. I was going through the whole list, and I worked it out. There were about 100 scholars, librarians, curators who were actually engaged in putting together the exhibitions and the projects. Next slide. And then on April the 2nd, 1976, the festival opened. And the festival had a series of 6 films which we, the Trust, had made. And of course, the BBC had then come to us and bought it from us and showed it 2 or 3 times during the festival. And this created a kind of a storyline for all the other exhibitions and events, the performances, the educational program, the publications. It was a massive program. And we go to the next slide. This is one of the posters for the project, which you see at the Quran exhibition in the middle, and then the science exhibition, the arts of Islam, the Nomad and City, music and musical instruments. Next slide. And then, of course, the wonderful moment on April the 7th, when Her Majesty the Queen opened the Arts of Islam exhibition, and there was an immense gathering in the Queen Elizabeth Hall. And next slide. Next slide. And then if we look at just some of the statistics, 32 nations, 6,000 objects from 250 public and private collections. More than 50 publications came out at the time of the festival, 20 musical recitals, 162 lectures, 50 days of academic seminars. All the universities that had Islamic departments or Arabic departments were involved. A vast educational program and a massive press coverage. And the festival ended up, I think, costing somewhere in the region of $4 million, which, of course, in today's money is a huge sum. Next slide. But the actual coverage of the press was quite phenomenal. Every major publication did special supplements. And every aspect, from cartoons right through to very serious articles, emanated from the festival. Next slide. And finally, this is the moment when I presented to Professor Yasser Suleiman, who is the director of the Center of Islamic Studies in Cambridge at the university, and the professor of Arabic he was before. I presented to him for their library the full 5 volumes of press cuttings, which of course have now become of immense interest because they're an amazing snapshot of the nature of the world and the relationship with Islam and the Islamic world at that time. And finally, the last slide was that the festival had become almost forgotten because that wonderful moment of opening was covered quite rapidly with the Iranian Revolution and then the whole Islamic terror and everything that took place, the way Islam became associated with something quite different from what we had presented in the festival. And the festival became really quite a forgotten thing. And then one day, about a few years ago, young librarians at the British Library started coming across all these references to the festival, and they wanted to know a bit about it. So they got into touch with Sadia Ahmed from the Everyday Muslim, and together they put together this Revisiting the World of Islam Festival, a celebration on the 40th anniversary at SOAS, at the School of Oriental African Studies. And they got in touch with me, and I had to dust off my memories and try to recall and start to remember this extraordinary event, which is now being quite rapidly sort of rediscovered, which is of great satisfaction to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. What a wonderful presentation. I think I want to go to an early slide. And by the way, everybody, whoever wants to ask a question, just raise your hand on the chat, and I will turn your video on if you wanted, or turn your audio on. You could also type your questions in the chat, and if you want to ask the question on video, I will also allow that. But I think I want to go here and ask about Ahmed. This is a huge endeavor. I can't imagine this taking place even today. You're talking about borrowing from 32 countries, and when logistics wasn't that easy, when you didn't have, I think, so many companies like DHL and FedEx and UPS and Aramex and all these firms that deliver, borrowing 6,000 objects, some of which are glass and so delicate and can be, I don't suppose everybody would be readily willing to loan. I mean, my question to you is, do you think this exhibition could take place today?
No, impossible. Absolutely impossible.
Why?
How could you get the, how could you actually get the objects together? It's an impossibility. I mean, it was, we see, the great advantage we had was that Islam wasn't an issue when the festival took place. And also the British institutions had tremendous status at that time. And there were some very remarkable curators. And of course, that world of curators and librarians was an international world. They were all linked up. They were very closely connected. So so for example, when we went to Egypt, the question of getting those great Mamluk Qurans to go down into the library, the great library, where they had all these phenomenal Qurans, and the business of actually bringing them over to England, the possibility that made that, what made it possible was the fact that there was a relationship between the curator in the British Museum, Basil Gray, and Wasia Izzi, who was the director of the museum, the Islamic Museum, and other people. So all of these interconnections made it possible. And believe you me, one of the reasons why, interestingly enough, it would be impossible today is that the librarians and curators today in these different institutions have nothing like the power that they had in the 60s and 70s. In those days, the curator, the librarian was king. You didn't have 100 administrators sitting on their heads like you have today. It's a completely different situation. It's like the professors in the university. I could go as a nobody in my 20s. I could get a meeting with the director, the head of the School of Oriental African Studies, within a period of about 2 weeks, and go and see him and talk to him, and then we could have lunch together. That's impossible today. So it was a much closer world in terms of human relationships then.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'll ask Rachel to unmute. Rachel, would you ask your question on video?
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I'm so glad that we are all reevaluating the importance of this festival I wanted to ask you a question about something that I found in the archives and that I think many people don't know about this festival, which was the role of contemporary artists. So I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit about the role that contemporary artists played in helping you sort of visualize parts of this festival, including, I think, Osman Wakiala, Ahmed Mustafa, and Ali Omar Ermez, I believe, were the three involved.
Well, Osman Wagiala's contribution was that he did that beautiful logo. So his actual work was one in which he was actually, this is a traditional piece of calligraphy. So it's not to do with modern art. It's a traditional piece of calligraphy. Ali Omar had a relationship right at the very beginning. And he was a friend, but he wasn't actually involved in the, the selection process. So it was right at the very beginning when I was actually planning the whole festival out that I knew him and I had conversations with him. Who was the other one?
Ahmed Mustafa is listed in, I think, some of the paperwork somewhere.
I don't think he was involved. I mean, if he was, it would have been very peripheral. Certainly, it didn't come to my notice. There wasn't any exhibition, and I don't think at that time he was involved in modern art so much. Was he? Was he a figurative artist then?
He was figurative in the 60s and he converted to calligraphy in the 70s. That's right.
I think it was after the festival that actually, because the interesting thing about the festival is that the festival actually did have quite an impact on a lot of individuals and the creation of a number of institutions within the Islamic world. That doesn't sound very helpful, does it?
No, that was actually very helpful. That was great. Thank you.
If I may make a quick note, Osman Wagihallah, who was the Sudanese artist, was responsible or was invited by the Saudis. He was from Sudan, and he was invited by the Saudis to write the calligraphy on the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad. So he's very, very important artist in Africa. Is that him?
Yes, there was a beautiful man, a wonderful man, and a wonderful logo, a very beautiful logo.
Okay, I have a question from Ria Hadid. Ria, would you like to turn on your video, or you'd like to ask your question on audio? Go ahead.
Yes, hi. My name is Ria Haddad. Yes, and my question is this: we struggle as Arabs and Muslims with attention. Because we always have a fear that it comes from the interest comes from from a colonial point of view, rather than from a pure academic interest and with integrity. So from where you stood at that time when the festival happened, did you see that line from your vantage point? Where was that line between the traditional interest that was very colonial and orientalist and the pure academic interest with integrity?
It's a very, very interesting question.
Thank you.
And you see, my experience myself was that I did not come from a curatorial or a Islamic studies or any of these backgrounds. I wasn't involved in studying it from that perspective. And coming into it through a master musician, through a traditional master, what it did for me is and I had a big art background, but it was in modern art. What it did for me is it would open the way of being able to look at and appreciate the art from inside. Now, I'll give you an example of this. At the time when the festival was being planned, any book on Islamic art would start with Persian miniatures. And it would be under the understanding that somehow there was something lacking in Islamic art. because of the lacking of the figure. So the figurative, the question of the figurative was always approached on the basis that it wasn't allowed. Very quickly, I began to understand that it wasn't a matter of not being allowed. It was simply that it couldn't express the unity that is at the heart of Islam. In other words, the highest principle in existence, which is unity, can only be expressed in other ways. And in fact, music is very important in this respect. But if you look at Islamic art, calligraphy, and illumination and geometric pattern, this manifests unity, balance, mizan. And so the minute you start reflecting upon the art in terms of its actual context, what is it there for? What is it expressing? It's expressing something completely different from that of Western art. And the traditional masters were the ones who were able to give one that access, that comprehension, that vision. Now, the European people engaged, the Orientalists, who had phenomenal knowledge, but their knowledge was very, very circumscribed, and it was very specific, and it was very object-based. So for them, it was the pottery, or the glasswork, or the carpets, and the object took over really took over the major focus. So to go around a museum with Basil Gray, in terms of objects, was extraordinary. It was amazing because he could really show you an object and show you the beauty of it. But when it came to its place within the whole civilization, its context, this did not interest them. And also they were viewing it very much as a kind of secular religious, the religious aspect was definitely something that was intimidating. So to relate it to religion was quite a problem. We had one amazing moment in the Arts of Islam exhibition at the Hayward, when Edmund de Unger, who had a very large collection, and we had a minbar from Syria, and we had a mihrab from Iraq, or it was the other way around, I can't remember. And at one moment he said, Ibn Unger said, we have to put the mihrab and the minbar in different galleries. If we put them together, people will think it's a religious exhibition. Just imagine. Imagine. So there is, I mean, it's very difficult when you're coming from when your whole ethic, your whole world is within one world, and you're looking at the other world from outside, you will place upon that world your system, your structure, and you'll judge it according to that. It's very difficult to go beyond that. So one did see the difference very clearly.
Ahmed, thank you for that elaborate answer. You sort of did answer this question. This is from Sarah Rifki, and she asks, in what way does this type of project intersect with discourses on Orientalism, and what type of criticism did it receive in its time?
Is that Sarah who?
Sarah Rifki.
Sarah Rifki.
Sarah Rifki. So it's a scholar based in Boston, the US, and she asks, in what type, how does this project intersect with discourses on Orientalism, and what type of criticism did it receive in its time?
Gosh, that's quite a question. I think that the interesting thing about the project was that it was conceived in order to try to present Islam, Islamic civilization, in terms of its own criteria. And therefore, the Orientalists' values actually didn't impugn upon the fundamental structure of the festival. What happened was that their phenomenal knowledge on the different aspects of the different arts and the selection of the different things and their cataloguing of the rest of it slotted in and contributed towards building this extraordinary picture. So, for example, the exhibition of the Nomad and City, you had one very good little exhibition on the Nomad, which Sheila Weir organized from the Museum of Mankind. And Bob Sargent from Cambridge University with a team did this beautiful exhibition on the city of Sana'a. But the actual formulation of the importance of the city and the nomad, that incredibly important tension which exists within Islamic civilization, was presented. That's not something that came from the Orientalists. That came from the fundamental structure of the festival that was worked out. Criticisms, mamma mia.
Yes.
You really got problems there. I tell you that I haven't actually read all the press cuttings. There are far too many of them, and it was well received at the time. It was well received. I can't really answer that.
No worries. Thank you, Ahmed.
I haven't actually, you see, I haven't actually, it's only recently to recall the festival. I mean, I was so engaged in actually putting it together that one sort of, I'll tell you one interesting one that came up with the Science Museum.
Okay.
And that was that there was a tremendous amount of opposition from the curators at the Science Museum, because they said that Islamic science has nothing to do with science, with modern science. It doesn't belong. So that was quite an interesting engagement, which again, one could go into that and one could write a whole book about that whole question.
Thank you, Ahmed. Ahmed, we have a question from, is it Hassan Bauda? Go ahead. Please unmute yourself, Hassan.
Assalamu alaikum all. Jazakallah, Ahmed, for taking us through that journey. The question, my background is I'm currently a doctoral researcher at Tate, looking at religion, secularism, and Muslims in Britain, and how Tate considers that within strategy, audiences, and programming. So it's quite a relevant space to hear such a significant part of how museums framed Islam within Britain. But one thing that I'm particularly interested in is Muslim communities today within Britain and how they engage with museums and art museums per se. So I was thinking, from your perspective, I know it's only recently you're recalling, and I'm sure there's just so much information and experience to bring into the conversation. But what kind of, from your perspective, what kind of engagement do you feel the festival had on first and second generation Muslims who are in Britain from that post-colonial migration? And secondly, from linked to that question, is reflecting on my own experiences growing up in London, third generation. I never really heard of the world of Islam. It's not part of our community's cultural memory. And many people, and I rarely come across people who would remember the World of Islam Festival as a concept, when rather that kind of memory sticks within the institutions. So I was just wondering if that's an experience you also have come across, or any thoughts on that point.
Thank you, Hassan.
Yes, well, I did touch upon it. The incredible thing about the World of Islam Festival is that it was completely buried from consciousness, because when the Iranian Revolution happened and Islam became the big issue, you must realize that when the festival took place, Islam was not an issue. It's difficult to imagine today, but Islam was simply not an issue. the BBC turned it down because there just wouldn't be enough interest. So when it happened, there was a huge interest at the time. And it had an enormous impact on the Muslim world because all the ambassadors were there, people came from abroad, the press people came. It made a tremendous impact at the time. But this was completely buried. And when you talk about the Muslim community at the time and forgetting it or it not being remembered, it's true of the institutions. I mean, the whole thing came to light simply because two librarians at the British Library kept on coming across references, young people, you know, kids, and they said, what was this thing? You know, it must have happened. So they started digging away, and suddenly they uncovered this huge event. So the actual way that it disappeared is of enormous interest. For me, it was something which was, you know, my life is in two parts. It's up to the festival, and it's after the festival. And after the festival, it was hard work presenting Islam. Unbelievable. It became, you know, by 1980, 81, it was impossible. You couldn't mention it. So this bearing is, however, at the time, you will find, and I keep on finding this happening in this wonderful everyday Muslim society, who are doing incredible work. They're actually recovering quite a lot of knowledge from your community of the older people. And I'm getting people coming up to me saying, you know, when I give my lectures, and they come and say, you know, I came to all the events of the festival. It was a great moment in my life. So it did have an impact upon the generations. And I think it was something which gave them, you know, but you've got to remember that the people who were around, that your wonderful first generation Muslims, who are real heroes, who came here to work in the cotton mills, to work in the factories, to work on the buses, to do all the things that we asked them to do. We brought them over. And then they had nothing because all these things closed, and they opened their shops and they had to work. And these people were working so much, they weren't in the cultural zone. So it was very interesting because it was the student societies that got interested, like FOSIS and, you know, the different, some of the different agencies, they got involved in the festival. We had many, many meetings and a very interesting engagement with all of this. But you're right, the thing was buried. It just disappeared from view. It was quite extraordinary because the whole approach to Islam and to the Islamic civilization went completely upside down. It changed diametrically, 100%. Quite extraordinary. You know, from being no issue at all, it became the big issue in a way that was really completely the opposite to what we were doing with the festival.
Ahmed, thank you so much. I have a question from Alexandra Kurkula, who asks, do you feel that, or does Islamic art for you encompass other religions? For example, the arts of Christian and Jewish populations that were part of the Islamic world?
If you look at the Jewish synagogues within Islam, they encompass Islamic art. They adopt it. The same thing with much less so with the Christian, because the Christian has a very specific, very key, iconic structure, which was there before Islam. And Christians participated in that public engagement in terms of craft. Many Christian and Jewish craftsmen of different, which were providing things for but it was within the Islamic mode. If you think of today, you're talking about modern art is the kind of, you know, it's the general thing. The Tate Gallery is the great power in the world today in terms of art. So everywhere you have modern art. It was the same with the world of Islam. The impact of Dar al-Islam, the impact of Islamic art on Chinese art is formidable. The impact of Islamic civilization in terms of architecture and art on Gothic art is formidable. Why? Because during that 1,000 years, the power of Islamic civilization was phenomenal. And that's something we don't know, we don't understand today, because of course the power has been lost. But everywhere, you go into Russia, you go everywhere, the whole of the Hindu world is deeply saturated with the impact of Islam.
I have a question from Ghada. Ghada, you can ask your question, but please be very, very brief.
Thank you, Sultan. Ghada Al-Harthi, Associate Lecturer with Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts, London. Thank you, Ahmed, for this amazing presentation and for sharing it with us. I mean, for the first time, I'm sorry I was not born in the 50s or 60s, so I can attend the festival. Some might question the validity of Islamic and contemporary Middle Eastern art pieces as an investment. How do you think those pieces are doing compared to the 80s and 90s in terms of their valuation and appreciation in the market or in auctions? That's my question.
Thank you.
I'm afraid you're moving out of my comfort zone. I'm not involved in the area of purchasing art. I don't know. Please forgive me. I can't satisfy you.
Thank you, Ahmed, for that. Maybe a quick question from an artist, an abstract artist, Sami Halabi, who asked, do you consider medieval Arab art the first abstraction in art history?
Again, it's a very big question. Because again, we're dealing with the whole question of art history, which is a problematic thing already. I would suggest that the particular nature of Islamic abstract geometric art, the Mizan structure of architecture is unique. And what is important about it is that it is the way of manifesting unity, of making unity visible. And that is at the very center and at the heart of the whole Islamic revelation. So when we talk about the Islamic environment did one extraordinary thing. And that was that it created a universal world. From West Africa through to China, all the different languages, all the different cultures, all the different prehistories, all the different worlds became one. Because the system, craftsmen could travel from Morocco to India and practice. You could literally, a craftsman could go right across the Islamic world and pick up and practice calligraphy and illumination and abstract pattern. And this is the remarkable thing. And you see, I'll leave you with this one thought for you, and that is that there can only be one universal. You can't have two universals. And the one universal manifestation in our experience, of our knowledge of history, has been in Islamic civilization.
Thank you. Ahmed, my last question to you is, would you do it all over again?
Oh, please.
Is that a yes?
No, the festival, we have to do other things today. We have to do other things today. The festival was very much of its time. And it was one of those things which happened quite extraordinary. If I hadn't lost the money in the first festival, I would never have had the courage to engage with the second one. because the second festival took place because I was in a corner. And I had to go and do something extraordinary to get out of the hole that I was in. And this is the extraordinary thing. If I hadn't met Ustad Mohammed Mirza, because that project could not have come out of the museum, it couldn't have come out of the established institutions. It had to come from an extraordinary situation. It was unusual. And it was the, you know, it was what set my whole life up. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much.
Now we're talking about it 40, 50 years later. It's very, very nice.
Thank you so much, Ahmed Paul Keeler, who joined us from England. Thank you so much to Rachel Winter for the introduction, for all of you for attending not only this Majlis, but the Majlises over the past few months. This is the 44th and final Majlis for this season. I'll be back in the next few weeks. Until then, please stay safe. This video will be uploaded in the next 24 hours, so make sure to share it with your friends. Look after yourselves, and I'll see you guys in October, hopefully. All the best. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.